Another book I want to recommend to you is this book, Endgame, written by the two generals that you've seen on Fox News quite a lot, Lieutenant General McInerney and Major General Tom Vallely. I had the pleasure of meeting General McInerney a couple of weeks ago at the event here at the Biltmore. Endgame is a story about nuclear scenarios. The nightmare scenarios that they have are about a terrorist nuclear attack on the United States. I just want to quote here. Getting the bombs or the components for the bombs in the United States would be simple. They're relatively small and easily concealed in a large cargo or shipping container. Smuggling them into the United States would not be difficult because despite the steps taken after September 11th, our borders remain inexcusably porous. And they continue to remain porous, leaving us vulnerable because our administration doesn't seem to have the courage and the motivation to secure our borders. Now, all of this was in what I call the education era of immigration reform. And then an interesting thing happened in 2004. I was involved, I led the effort in Arizona to pass Proposition 200, which was their version of Proposition 187. They basically wanted to just not pay taxpayer benefits to illegal aliens, and they wanted to be sure illegal aliens weren't voting in their elections. And what happened was, since we've moved into this new media environment where we're in the 24-hour news cycle, was Arizona became something that the cable news channels were interested in, and we got a lot of coverage in Arizona. We ended up with winning the election in Arizona in 2004 with 56% of the vote. An interesting sideline is that Hispanics in Arizona voted for Proposition 200 more than they voted for President Bush. Arizona is a very red state, and Prop 200 got 5 points more from the Hispanic voter in Arizona than President Bush got. So, and we'll get to that, to the misinformation a little bit later. Following, in April of 2005, we had the first Minuteman deployment on the border. I know a lot of the leaders of the Minutemen. I know what they're all about. We've heard these claims of vigilantism. There's never been one claim of vigilantism that's ever been proven. I've been down on the border. David Aguilar, who is the current head of the Border Patrol when he was the Tucson sector chief, told the county supervisor group that there was no evidence of vigilantism on the border. The one case that the Mexican government tried to phony up about somebody being abused by the Minutemen was immediately dismissed because the Minutemen that were down there were smart enough to have a video camera on the Mexican that walked into their group the entire time. And when the Border Patrol looked at it, they realized that there was no abuse and there were no charges filed. Anyway, the Minutemen we reached a tipping point with the media when the Minutemen were down there because they all went down to the border to find the Minutemen misbehaving. Basically what they found was ACLU types sitting around in their cars smoking marijuana. But they didn't find anything bad. But what happened was it reached a tipping point with the media, both the news media as well as talk radio, who began to talk about the issue quite a lot. The third thing that happened was something that we're about to see a repeat of, I believe. It happened last year when, as a result of the True Enforcement Immigration Bill that was sponsored by Duncan Hunter of San Diego and Virgil Goode of Virginia, Jim Sensenbrenner and the White House got together and realized that if they didn't start pushing their enforcement bill, true enforcement was going to pass. When these bills started to come out, that was when we started to see the marches and the protests in the country. That was April of last year, and it certainly culminated on May 1st with all the marches in the streets. And I think that was where we reached a tipping point with the American public. And those three things, the election in 2004 in Arizona, the Minutemen in 2005, and the enforcement bills, and then the subsequent marches and the protests by all the illegal aliens last year, I think has put us into a new era in immigration where we're now in the policy era. We're now in an era where we have policymakers on TV talking about passing legislation, and that is a good thing. It's taken us a long time to get here, and there's been a lot of damage done to our country in the process, but we're finally to the point where we're talking about policy and solutions and what to do, and we don't have to stand around all the time saying, look at the hole in the fence, you're ignoring the hole in the fence. They're not ignoring it anymore. How am I doing on time? Where's Marcus? About 10 minutes to go. All righty. Now, I want to show you a couple of things, and I want to talk to you about the opposition. First of all, how many people have heard of the Mexican matricula card, matricula consular card? Nobody had ever heard of the matricula consular before October of 2001. When we realized after the 9/11 attack that the 9/11 hijackers had about 62 driver's licenses that were issued by 3 different states, we thought, this is it. We can now start talking about document security in a way that makes sense. And we came back, and I was in the news, a number of us activists were in the news talking about document security, and all of a sudden the Matricula Consular card came up. This was a secure ID card that the Mexican government issued, and that we shouldn't have any fear of giving driver's licenses to illegal aliens because the Matricula Consular card was going to ensure that these people were who they said they were. This was a complete fraud. The Matricula Consular card has been around for years. It is so bad, it's to the point to where the Mexican consulate is handing them out at like Safeways and bank openings. There's no security, there's no central database. We now have Bank of America and Wells Fargo where you're allowing people to use the Matricula Consular to open up bank accounts. You can't open a bank account in Mexico with a Matricula Consular card. That's the truth. You cannot do it. It is not a secure ID card at all. But as I went from state capital to state capital, and Sacramento, Denver, Topeka, and Austin come to mind because I did those in quick succession talking about document security, we started to hear about this fabulous Matricula Consular card. And then I started to see some common denominators as I went from state capital to state capital. I had a friend in the East that was going, and we were kind of comparing notes. And we realized that a lot of the activists that wanted to reduce document security were reading from a handbook that was actually prepared by MALDEF called the Immigrant Access to Driver's Licenses, a Tool for Advocates. This was actually written by the American Immigration Lawyers Association, MALDEF, the National Council of La Raza, the National Immigration Law Center. This is a handbook on what to do to convince your politicians that what you ought to do is give driver's licenses to illegal aliens or people that we basically know nothing about. In the West, it was being pushed by the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, and in the East, it was being pushed by the ACLU. And you all know who that is. I mean, this is after 9/11, okay, when we know, we're not for sure how many driver's licenses the 9/11 hijackers had. We heard 62. Our opponents will say it was less than that. The one thing we do know for sure, in the, not this is the 9/11 Commission report. They actually have 2 other reports that they put out, and one of them was the Terrorism and Travel report. We do know that the 9/11 hijackers between them had almost 500 aliases. So we don't know how many driver's licenses that they had. It seems almost laughable that I have to go from state capital to state capital to argue in favor of our driver's license, the one ID card that we do carry in this country, most of us carry, when the 9/11 Commission actually says that secure identification should begin in the United States. The federal government should set standards for the issuance of birth certificates and sources of identification, such as driver licenses. Fraud in identification documents is no longer just a problem of theft. At many entry points to vulnerable facilities, including gates for boarding aircrafts, sources of identification are the last opportunity to ensure that people are who they say they are and to check whether they are terrorists. And I read this to them up in Sacramento again just last week, 2 weeks ago, and it was like falling on deaf ears. It was as if 9/11 never happened. The Cedillo bill, SB 1160, passed out of committee. There wasn't even a debate. It's a sure thing it's going to end up on Governor Schwarzenegger's desk again, and we can only hope, and we're going to be asking the governor to veto the bill again, because not only is it important to California, but there are a number of states, having traveled to states and talked to state legislators, that if California drops, we could see like a half a dozen states decide, well, it's okay to start licensing illegals.